Hello, senior scholars. Tom Mandeville back. This is the material leading up to week four's class. And basically what we're going to be covering this week is the first half, essentially, of General Burgoyne's invasion of the Champlain Valley in 1777. So I'm going to send you the chronology of the Rev War. I suppose it's volume 3, so you can follow along with this. And as you'll see when you take a look at that, in the winter of 76 and 77, after British forces led by Sir Guy Carleton had retreated back to Canada after the Battle of Elcourt, which we covered last class, the troops stationed at Mount Independence and Fort Ty, which had peaked somewhere between 10 and 13,000. We don't know for sure because it's hard to keep track of the different militias that came in and so forth. But that's a very sizable force during the Revolutionary War. And that was at its height in the fall when Carleton was observing it. During the winter months, a lot of these men are released from the military, especially militias, sent back to their homes. And the force that was left there in the winter of 76, 77 was about 3,000 men. And it's going to be a brutal winter. A lot of men are going to freeze to death. There'll be shortages of food and firewood and so forth. So it's going to be very, very brutal on these men. But remarkably, under the brave leadership of Chief Engineer Jeduthan Baldwin, who we've mentioned before, finished the construction of the Horseshoe Battery, which is up on the point overlooking the lake towards the north, and the Star-Shaped Fort in November. And then in February, with the assistance of Polish engineer Thaddeus Kukoskus, who had joined the rebels from Poland, started construction of the floating bridge, which would be connecting Mount Independence to Fort Ty. Now, I'm going to send you an artist's depiction of that bridge so you can visualize it better. But the way that they did it is they built these huge log cribs on the ice. They filled them with stone, then attached a chain to a floating bridge. So when the ice melted in the spring, these cribs sunk to the bottom of the straits there between Mount Independence and Fort Ty, and the bridge was held intact by chains and floated across, connecting the two. Pretty ingenious, especially building this thing on the ice in the winter of 76 and 77. So the next thing, and one other item of construction as far as Mount Independence is concerned, they were able to complete the hospital that was there in April and May. Now, as you can see, the next thing occurs February 28, 1777. General Burgoyne, who had been with Sir Guy Carleton on board one of the ships, had returned back to England, and he submits his plan to crush the rebels in the Champlain Valley and separate off New England like their master plan had been all along, to Colonel Secretary Lord George Germain. The plan involves cutting off New England, two-prong attack in New York. His army would be led down onto Lake Champlain and then ultimately on the Hudson River and connecting with forces coming north out of New York. Then there'd be a smaller contingency that would come in from the Mohawk River Valley and also converge on Albany. That group will be led by General St. Ledger. Now, on June 13th, General Burgoyne has returned to Canada by that point. He's got his invasionary force all assembled at Saint Jean on the Richelieu, and they're going to start the invasion of New York on June 13th, 1777. And as you can see, his army was about 9,000 troops, including 4,000 British regulars, 3,200 Germans, sometimes called Hessians, but it's more accurate to call these particular troops Brunswickers, and they were under the command of Major General Friedrich Adolf Rundeisel. Now, these troops were hired as mercenaries by the Brits way back in 1775 to just show the rebels that they meant business. Now they're going to be engaged in heavy combat. There's also nearly 1,800 American loyalists, a contingency of Native American warriors who we'll be talking about, Canadian militia, civilian employees who obviously have to tend to the needs of this huge army, and others known as camp followers. Now, camp followers would be the women, the wives and children of soldiers who would accompany them on a campaign like this. They would also be paid a little bit, and they would do such things as the cooking, the laundry, and things like that. So all told, this group was somewhere near 11,000 people that invaded New York. And that's just Burgoyne's group. So they start making their way down the Richelieu. On June 14th, 15th, they're going to encamp at Point-au-Fer, gathering supplies, buying things from local farmers, and waiting for the land detachment to catch up with the water detachment. Then, sometime between the 16th and 19th, they'll be encamped at Cumberland Head, gathering more materials that they're going to need. And then, in the meantime, General Simon Fraser, who we talked about before at the Battle of Three Rivers, he was a colonel back then, I believe. He's going to be the one who leads the advance corps, as they're known, the advance troops for Burgoyne's invading force. By June 17th, those advance forces will make their way down to the mouth of the Boquet River near present-day Willsboro. Now, General Burgoyne's main force, who always follows behind General Fraser in the advance corps, will reach the mouth of the Boquet on June 20th. And they'll encamp there for the next 10 days. Now, that wasn't intentional, but after a couple of days of camping there, there's some very adverse weather conditions on the lake, especially, which makes it very difficult for the water portion of Burgoyne's forces to advance south. So they're going to remain encamped until the weather clears. Now, what's important about this encampment at the mouth of the Boquet are a couple of proclamations that Burgoyne will make. But before I talk about those, I was negligent to also mention a couple other things just about General Burgoyne himself, so you can kind of get a taste for what he was all about. And as many of you probably know, he was known as Gentleman Johnny because at one point in his life, he was an actor, a playwright, a politician in Parliament, then a general in the military, and he was always trying to make a big name for himself, especially That's why he entered the military and was commissioned as a general. Uh, he was like the finer things in life. And unfortunately, this is, well, fortunate for us, but unfortunate for the British. This is really going to cost the Brits on this invasion in 1777. He was getting antsy to invade, and he probably should have waited another week in June to invade to allow more wagons and horses to arrive to accompany his invasionary force, but he didn't. And there were fewer wagons, horses, especially to carry the personal belongings along the way on the shore, following the troops who were traveling mainly by water. And Burgoyne, getting this nickname Gentleman Johnny, and from his days in London, insisted upon having so much personal baggage that he brought along with him that it would take up 30 of the horse-drawn carts. And included in this personal baggage were case upon case of champagne, caviar, and all the furniture to outfit his marquee tent that he had set up wherever he camped, with a foldable bed and chairs and tables and so forth. So when you went into his command tent, what he wanted it to replicate was an apartment in London. And from reports I've read, it looked just like one. In fact, for a while, down at Saratoga one time when I had a group there, they had received Burgoyne's bed on loan from a museum, which slips my mind where it came from, who has this. But that foldable bed that was set up for him every night to sleep in, obviously he's not sleeping in a bedroll or a cot. He had this bed that would go in an apartment in London. Now, also, with some of these harebrained decisions he made in the beginning, he's got part of the German Brunswickers that are with him are troops known as dragoons. They're like German cavalry. And unfortunately, they didn't have horses to ride on. Burgoyne always operated under the assumption he would obtain them horses sooner or later from loyalists, buy them along the way or whatever. We'll be talking about later how desperate they get for these horses. That's why the Battle of Bennington occurs, but that we'll be covering next week. So, he insisted upon having these dragoons march with him with all their equipment they normally would have on horseback. And to give you an idea, just their boots alone that they wore as cavalrymen, heavy leather boots that went well above the knee to protect against the slash of a sword in battle, weighed 12 pounds. And these guys are marching in them. This was a huge mistake. These guys are going to be worn out and desperate as the time goes on. Also, Burgoyne overdid it with how much artillery he demanded to bring along. He insisted upon hauling 138 pieces of artillery along with them, which will really become a pain in the butt after they start traveling south out of Skenesboro, because there isn't really a road that exists connecting Skenesboro to the south to Fort Edward. His men are going to have to construct one as they go, and we'll be talking about the trials and tribulations of that next class when we cover the second half of this invasion. But I just wanted to clear up why they called him Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, and for good reason. So, As I mentioned before, where we left off, they're encamped at the mouth of the Boquet River near present-day Willsboro. And on the 20th, Burgoyne makes his proclamation of war, which is typical in an invasion like this, and he reads it to the troops and any people who may have gathered from the area. Because remember, Gillian had a settlement down in the Willsboro area at this time. Now, I'm going to give you a complete copy of this in an attachment. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read the really important part of this. After he goes on for several paragraphs, he says, quote, "The intention of this address is to hold forth security, not depredation, to the country. To those whose spirit and principle may indulge to partake in the glorious task of redeeming their countrymen from dungeons and reestablishing the blessings of legal government, I offer encouragement and employment. And upon the first intelligence of their associations, I will find means to assist their undertakings. The domestic, the industrious, the infirm, and even timid inhabitants, I am desirous to protect, provided they remain quietly at their houses, that they do not suffer their cattle to be removed, nor their corn or forage to be secreted or destroyed, that they do not break up their bridges or roads, nor any other act, directly or indirectly, endeavor to obstruct the operations of the king's troops, or supply or assist those of the enemy. Every species of provision brought to my camp will be paid for at an equitable rate in solid coin." What he's saying here is, if you remain loyal to the crown, if you're a loyalist, he welcomes you to join the fight. And his intelligence reports had indicated that down in the upper Hudson Valley and southern Vermont, there was a stronghold of loyalists. And really, this is what this proclamation is directed at. He's also telling them his men will not, even if they decide not to partake and assist him in his quest, they will be secure if they remain in their homes. They will not be attacked by British troops. And that if Burgoyne needs their cattle for food or their corn or whatever, they will be paid for it. They will not just come in and steal it from them. So he's trying to rest the minds of the locals and also trying to recruit more forces at the same time. Now, on the very next day, a large contingency of Native American allies arrived and rendezvoused at the mouth of the Boquet River. Most of them were Iroquois. And he's going to make a special address just to these Indians. And what he's trying to, and I've included a little video I found that the Lakes to Locks did on this with Mountain Lake PBS. But what he's really trying to avoid here is things that had happened in the past in the North Country. During Queen Anne's War, in February of 1704, there's the famous French raid on Deerfield. This is back when the British and French are still battling it out for the North American continent in the series of wars. This particular war, Queen Anne's War. And in February 1704, French troops and mainly their Native American Algonquian allies out of the St. Lawrence River Valley had a surprise raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts. It quickly became known in the colonies as the Deerfield Massacre. And this was a strategy by the French to try to instill fear into civilian populations, because they attacked mainly civilians in this raid. And in the end, it'll backfire severely on the French. And they will end up riling up New Englanders to volunteer to assist the British in Queen Anne's War. And in the end result, victory will be for the British in that important conflict. Then during the French and Indian War, there was the famous event known as the Great Betrayal after the conquering of Fort William Henry in August of 1757, the British fort being conquered by the French. The British troops had been guaranteed by the French command safe evacuation and passage after they surrendered to Fort Edward. But all of these British soldiers had laid down their arms, and these men, women, and children, a couple days after the fall of the fort, were guaranteed this safe passage to be able to march peacefully back down to the British fort at Fort Edward from the southern end of Lake George. Well, what's going to happen during this march is they're attacked by Indian allies of the French. These Indian allies felt betrayed by the French because typically, after a big victory like this, they get to go in and pillage the fort. They weren't allowed to this time under the terms of surrender. So they attack these unarmed people, and it's a massacre, commonly known as the Great Betrayal. And it's, there's a book written on that. It's in Last of the Mohicans. It's a major part in that book by James Fenimore Cooper. It was a horrific event. So people up here in the North Country had a bad taste in their mouths when it came to Indian allies of whatever force it may be. So when these Indian allies arrived, Burgoyne wanted to make sure they knew the rules, so to speak. And I'll give you a whole copy of this address to the Native Americans that he delivered. And I'm going to read the real important part of it so you get the gist of it right now. Burgoyne says, I positively forbid bloodshed when you are not opposed in arms. Now remember, he's talking to Indian warriors. Aged men, women, children, and prisoners must be held sacred from the knife or hatchet, even in the time of actual conflict. You shall receive compensation for the prisoners you take, but you shall be called to account for scalps. In conformity and indulgence to your customs, which have affixed an idea of honor to such badges of victory, you shall be allowed to take the scalps of the dead when killed by your fire in fair opposition, but on no account or pretense or subtlety or prevarications are they to be taken from the wounded or even the dying, and still less pardonable, if possible, it will be held to kill men in that condition on purpose and upon a supposition that this protection to the wounded would there be by evaded. So in other words, what he's saying, leave civilians alone. You're only able to take prisoners and scalps from the dead who you've been fighting in combat. So hands off all civilians. Trying to avoid what happened earlier, in 1704 and 1757 right here in the North Country. Now, you'll find out the reason why I'm emphasizing this so much is this will come into play later on with the horrific death of Jane McCrae that we'll be covering right at the end of today's look at 1777. So, that's where I'm going to quit right now. We're at about the 25-minute mark. And I'm going to take a break, get a drink of water again like I always do, and then we'll pick up with General Fraser in the Advanced Corps taking Crown Point. So I'll see you in a few. Bye.